This is an example of a global rating Gestalt scale that we use on most of our OSCEs in the MD program as well as in my residency program. And I've adapted it over the years to try and find something that kind of works well. And essentially, this is the one we tend to use because most examiners can say no concerns, minor concerns, major concerns, but then most examiners also want to subdivide and split it so that they can say a bit more detail. Now, one of the key things is we have checklist items and rating scales that I'm not showing at the moment on this video. And students will get a score on those checklist items, which are usually a yes, no, they did or did not do it, or asked or did not ask. And then rating scales that talk about, the process of history or process of physical. And then what you do is you sum all those up, and that's the student's total sum score. Student might get 100%, 80%, 50%. But then they get this global Gestalt score at the end by the examiner, which is the examiners, they take a step back and think overall, what was that performance? For borderline group, you take all the candidates who scored a 3 or 4 on the 6-point scale, and you can use any scale that has a very clear borderline category, and you take the average of all those students, and that becomes the cut score. And I'll show you an example in a second. Now, the thing is, you really do want about 8 people or more in this borderline category for the borderline group method to be stable. Borderline regression, on the other hand, is a plot that I'm going to show you in a second that uses the entire axis. And then what you do is you see where the plot crosses 3.5 or wherever your middle borderline is, and that's your cut score. So here's an example of some OSCE data. I think this might have been from my residency program, I can't remember. But there's 2 things you may notice right off the bat. The first is nobody got a 1 or a 2. So you have to be careful about this using borderline regression if you don't have enough data points to truly extrapolate accurately. However, even though you don't have the 1 or the 2, the curves actually look pretty good. It looks like there's something appropriate happening with a nice straight line. But what you'll also notice is these 3 data points seem to be a little off. And there's a couple possibilities. Probably the most likely is this was a rater who scored the checklist and rating scale appropriate, so their actual score was correct, but they might have been a little off calibrated in terms of what the global should have been. So if you imagine if this rater had actually given this person a 3, this person a 4, and this person a 5, the curves would be a lot tighter. So this kind of data is very useful for me as I run this to then look into that examiner and see if there's a trend where their global is always a little too high. I don't have to adjust scores when it's a global, but if the other problem is their global on average is the same as everyone, but they're just a little harder, they weren't giving students certain checklist items, or maybe they literally just missed large categories of a score sheet, I can then see that and adjust for that. So one of the key points is these curves are helpful to know, do they meet the requirements to run a borderline group or a borderline regression analysis? If they don't, for all of my OSCEs, I always have an ANGOF to fall back on if it doesn't meet the criteria for borderline group and regression. And an ANGOF can always be done. It's just not as ideal for OSCEs because you have examiners in the room who can give you this information. But if it doesn't fit the assumptions of the test, then you go with an ANGOF. So borderline group would be averaging the score of all of these candidates, whereas borderline regression would be you cut it at the 3.5, and then there's your pass mark, and the cut score looks to be about 50% in this case. So I know that was a bit complicated, but students often ask, how do we set the pass mark at a station level? This is how we do it. Then in terms of the overall OSCE, there's a couple ways to do it. You can do this same borderline regression across the whole exam. Some organizations do that. What we more often do in the MD program and our residency program is we say out of 12 stations, how many you need to pass, because we view each station as a yes, no. And that's almost like an ANGOF of the whole 12 stations. So if I ran harder stations, I might say a lower number. If I ran easier stations, I might say a higher number. Generally, though, I don't tend to change the number between OSCEs because the stations, the difficulty will take care of itself within the station.